Chris Doyle. He's in London and the director at the Council for Arab-British Understanding. And Chris, I'd just like to get your views on what we've seen just in the last few minutes, that those lines of buses from Offa prison taking those Palestinian prisoners, and then what we saw play out between the Israeli soldiers and those Palestinians. It's hard to even call those clashes when one side is armed with stones and the other with live ammunition.
This has always been an asymmetrical conflict. So we have seen these scenes all the way back to the first Intifada in December 1987. Palestinian stone throwers against heavily armored Israeli soldiers. That's typical. And what it does show, though, is that whenever Israeli forces enter into any Palestinian urban area, such as you're seeing here in Beitunia, that they are likely to see young Palestinian kids throwing stones, occasionally Molotov cocktails. They will see it as an act of resistance. And it's one of the reasons why in the Oslo Accords that Israel redeployed its forces outside of these populated areas, so they didn't have these daily confrontations. But here, obviously, what we see in escorting these ICRC buses, the Israeli forces are right in the middle of a Palestinian population center. These will tend to be young soldiers. They'll be nervous. They're clearly using measures that an ordinary police force would not normally consider in such circumstances. That is also typical. They're flying off all sorts of different types of sound bombs, etc., tear gas, and the like. And that's very typical. You're seeing here something that's played out across the West Bank on an almost daily basis. But it's somewhat stranger to see it in these areas of what is southwest Ramallah, essentially, where you see Israeli forces in such a crowded area.
Yeah, and it is certainly interesting, as you say, and I would imagine that many of our international viewers who may not be familiar with the story of Palestinians and have only really found out more about what's happening in the occupied territory since the war on Gaza started, would find this quite shocking to see some of these images. And yet there are thousands of people who live like this on a daily basis. We've now heard from Mohammed Al-Qassem, who says there are more checkpoints that have been set up across the occupied West Bank. And of course, the occupied territories aren't very big at all, but they are under an occupation and very highly militarized zones that make life very difficult for Palestinians living there.
This is true. I mean, I know this area very well, and indeed Offa prison is right next to Offa military court. This is where Palestinians who live under military law, under Israeli military law, will be taken from everything from traffic offences to more serious crimes to be tried by a military judge. So the two, both the court and the prison, are part of one large complex that sits to the south of Ramallah, just north of Jerusalem. And the occupation affects every single aspect of Palestinian life, its movement. There's always checkpoints in the occupied territories in the West Bank. Some of them are like great big border terminals that separate Israeli-controlled areas to Palestinian urban areas. Some are flying checkpoints. These are ones that are put up temporarily, and we've seen a lot of this, where they will just suddenly, in the middle of a road, set up a checkpoint, and it just hinders access. Some are semi-permanent, but you also see the ways in which they cut off villages by putting up earth mounds, so you actually block the entrance and exit to a Palestinian village. You see also, of course, ditches. There is, of course, the barrier, the wall that runs from the north to the south of the West Bank, not along the Green Line that separates Israel from occupied territory. For the most part, is actually within occupied territory and was declared illegal. But the occupation controls access to healthcare, to education, to absolutely everything that civilians need for their day-to-day lives. And they feel that occupation every single day. This is one aspect when you see the level of military brutality. But remember also, there's other things that you don't see. There is the hidden occupation of permits, which doesn't allow you to go into another area of the West Bank with your vehicle or by foot unless you have the right permit. Most Palestinians in the West Bank can't get to East Jerusalem, which is at the core of the West Bank. All of this, the way you can't get building permits for your home. We've seen actually today a large number of demolitions in the occupied West Bank of homes. You cannot get a permit off the Israeli authorities, or at least it's extremely rare. The taking of land, the taking of water, other resources like stone, is something that has escalated in recent days. And if it's not the military that you see here, who are obviously meant to be well organized and disciplined, you then also have settlers, over 700,000 Israeli citizens colonizing the West Bank, who are above the law. And if they attack Palestinians, they're not held back. They're not punished for what they do. And settler violence has increased. And that's really terrifying for the Palestinians. At least with the army, they operate under a scintilla of discipline and order, whereas the settlers feel free to burn people's cars, their homes, their shacks, to kill livestock and intimidate and frighten children.
Yeah, and the key word I think here is illegal. Those settlers are, and the settler expansion is illegal under international law. And we've even seen under the Trump administration, which hasn't been in power for 10 days, I believe, they've even lifted some of the sanctions that were on some of those illegal Israeli settlers. And Chris, when you lay out all these restrictions and what life is like in the occupied West Bank, why then is there not more international reaction and condemnation for what these Palestinians are living under? It seems to have just become the norm now for so many years.
It has been normalized, it's deteriorated. The occupation has become ever more oppressive over the 57 years that it's lasted. And I think that obviously you can point to the unalloyed support of the United States for what Israel does, its failure to hold Israel to account to international law, and therefore some of its allies, including, for example, Britain at times, for certain. Also, that the asymmetry that we talked about, that Israel is the dominant power. It's a nuclear power that has essentially got a captive population under occupation. They cannot really fight the armed forces that are oppressing them every single day. It's not an equal fight at all. So it's very hard to shake off this occupation. And I think to the outside world, they don't actually get the manner of this occupation, just how intrusive it is into Palestinian lives, just how brutal it has been. Because for the most part, if you take a day that there aren't clashes, the occupation continues and it affects those lives, but in unseen ways. The way you can't move around, the way you wonder whether your child is going to get back from school safely due to settlers, the way that you're not sure if, for example, you could travel overseas for a medical appointment, or you could get to Jordan. So the occupation often has this invisible hand that is harder to see in the outside world. It's not always like we see in Gaza, where you see these horrendous images of moonscapes that the Israelis have absolutely decimated whole urban areas. It's not really like that in the West Bank. You can see images of, leafy olive groves, and you can get the impression that perhaps it's a fairly normal, wonderful environment with a nice climate. But the occupation is there, grinding levels that impact upon them. You see a degree of control that is quite extraordinary over this population. And it's sometimes hard to get this across into nice, packaged TV programs as to what it's like. How do you get across in a TV 3-minute news report what it's like to queue up for 3 to 4 hours at a checkpoint, to go through that checkpoint with soldiers with guns every single day? That is not something that's easily translatable to the outside world. So it's a huge challenge.
It's not easily translatable, but at the same time, it's also something that many people just don't want to acknowledge and can simply turn off their TV or change something on social media to not be able to see this because of the continued dehumanization of Palestinians that we see. But the images that we're looking at now, Chris, I'm not sure if you are able to see them, but they're from Ramallah, and these are the Palestinian prisoners who have been released on board that bus with officials from the Red Cross who have verified their identities. They have given them medical assessments too, and they will soon be reuniting with their incredibly excited and happy families to have them home. Chris, you mentioned earlier that Israel is like a nuclear power that is able to act, but it is also backed by arguably the most powerful country in the world, by the United States. And when you have that type of support, it also then allows you to act with very little to no impunity, because we may see some sort of backlash against Israel internationally. More countries have come out now to recognize Palestine as a state, but most of the world continues to do business with Israel. They are still getting weapons. Nothing much has changed, especially when your best friend essentially is the USA.
Well, it's true. It's really hard to put the pressure on. And you now have President Trump, who has surrounded himself with some extremely pro-Israeli government appointees. And it does not look as if he is going to hold back Israeli activity in the West Bank at all. And this means that the settler organizations feel that it is a real opportunity for them to help themselves to more and more land in the West Bank, to annex this area. And it's why I believe in 2025, we are going to see the core of the conflict move back to the West Bank. This is where I think this year we're going to see most of the military activity. And of course, we're already seeing that. Ramallah is normally quite quiet, but to the north of the West Bank, in Jenin and in Tulkarm and Tubas, we've been seeing an Israeli invasion. We've seen Israeli airstrikes. Israeli airstrikes were very uncommon, in fact, in the West Bank, but increasingly not so. So Israeli military operations are really ramped up and far more aggressive. And I think we're going to see more and more of this over the course of the next 12 months at least. And it's really hard to see who's going to put the pressure on. Europe is not united on this issue. There are countries like Hungary that stop any unanimous decision on behalf of the European Union. Germany, of course, is always reluctant for historic reasons to take any form of action against Israel. And outside the EU, you have Britain, which has also been very reluctant to be properly critical of Israel, or at least not to take any meaningful actions that would deter Israel from violating international law. So it's a pretty grim outlook. But, you know, you see these prisoners are about to be released, and it will be, I've been at prisoner releases before. It's a very joyous occasion for those families, whole communities, and yet you see Israeli armed forces going around and warning people not to celebrate. I mean, how inhumane is that you cannot allow people just to have one moment of joy when their loved one returns home? It is really quite unthinkable. And it is important that all the parties to this conflict, when they release detainees, hostages, prisoners, that they do so with respect to them and their loved ones. And this is not happening. It's not the fault of the International Committee of the Red Cross. It's the parties concerned to make sure that they are released in a dignified fashion. It is really, to have been in Israeli prison for 20, 30 years, as some of these detainees have been, is not something you would wish on anyone. There's been reports as to the extent of the use of abuse and torture in Israeli jails. It is a deprivation of freedom. Often they've been tried in military courts that have a very, let's be generous, shaky record in terms of justice. So it's a bittersweet moment, because also at the same time we've seen today Israeli forces arresting more Palestinians. So yes, 110 get released now, but many more are getting arrested the whole time. So the jails are not really emptying, they're just being replaced with new prisoners. And basically, if you're a young Palestinian male, it's pretty rare that you have not landed up in Israeli detention at some point or another.
Chris Doyle, thank you so much for your analysis and insight there, speaking to us from London. He's the director at the Council for Arab-British Understanding.